Hello, magical people of the internet. I'm Jen, and welcome to my vlog I Never Thought I Would, where you guessed it, we talk about doing things we never thought we would do and the fabulous places that they can lead us to. I have an incredible guest today. She is a fantasy mystery author. Her name is JP McLean. Hi, JP.
Hi, Jen. Great to see you. Great to be here.
Yeah, so nice to see you, and thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
I'm so excited to talk about your book series, but before we get into that, we have to cover the cost of entry, which is an I never thought I would story.
And I have one of those.
I'm sure you have several, considering your fascinating imagination. I'm sure there's more than one, but I know you've picked a special one to discuss with us today.
I have. The one I have chosen is one that has changed my life quite a bit, actually. I never ever imagined that I would spend a year living in rural Mexico in a very small mining town uh, the town was called La Colorada. And that was about 10 years ago. And I had the opportunity, thanks to my husband, who had been working down there, and he'd been going back and forth. And he one day said, "Would you like to spend some time down there, like real time down there?" And I didn't speak Spanish. I still don't speak Spanish. I wish I did, but I don't. But we bought ourselves a fifth wheel trailer, and we had two dogs at the time, and we hooked on to the trailer and drove in 6 days from Vancouver down to the mountains of Mexico and parked the RV in the mine manager's driveway and lived there for a year. And we were the only, they called us Gringa and Gringo. We were the only gringos there. Um, and we were quite a attraction. When we first moved in there, I would be in the trailer or in the yard with the dogs, and people would walk by and they were so polite. They were curious what the trailer was because they hadn't seen them before, but they would walk by and kind of surreptitiously glance over at me in the yard or the dogs, because the dogs too were, who keeps dogs on a string, the leash in their yards. But I found the people absolutely fascinating. Hard working people. They work 5.5 days a week. Their children are turned out in the most stunning white dresses and trousers for church on Sundays. And shopping was fascinating. We'd go, the town of La Colorada where we lived was too small to do your grocery shopping at. They had a store where you could get bimbo bread and some cans of soup and a few sweet treats. Milk you could get there, mostly canned or the irradiated kind that sits on the shelf.
Mhm.
But if you wanted to go and get chicken and steaks and vegetables and stuff, you pretty much had to go to another town, which was called Los Hombrete, and it was in the next state over. And it took us about an hour and a half to get there. And when we got to that little town, again, it's not in a part of Mexico that sees a lot of tourists. And my husband is 6'2" and white hair, so he stands out like a beacon. And I used to make him wear a hat. Stop people from staring at us. And again, we had the dogs, so people just don't walk down the street with dogs in these little towns on a leash. And then you'd go shopping, and the two things that I recall that were really amazing to me, I I was looking for a dozen eggs, as Canadians do. And I got to the egg seller lady, and she had those big flats of eggs stacked up. And so I thought, well, she's, doling them out. That's okay. So she looked at me, a dozen eggs, and said, yeah, a dozen eggs. And I'm wondering whether I'm saying it wrong. And no, she's very confused. But anyway, she takes a tray and she puts 12 eggs in the middle of it, puts another tray on top, strings it all up, and then weighs it, because you pay by the pound for eggs.
Mhm.
And when we got our eggs, we're walking down the street with our little two flat with the 12 eggs in the middle. We're passing people that have 4 flats completely full of eggs. So they eat a lot of eggs there. And I was clearly an amateur. And then the other thing we couldn't find was butter. They It's called La Mantequilla. And I'd go into every grocery store and they'd send me to the refrigerator where the Land O'Lakes, they'd sold Land O'Lakes margarine. And I bought that for the longest time because I couldn't get them to tell me where the butter was. And one day I was in the butcher shop. That's where I found the butter. It's sold in bulk and they just take a knife and whack off a chunk and put it on paper and there's your butter. So finally found butter after all that time.
I'm so intrigued by this because so many Canadians go on vacation in Mexico, but we usually go to touristy resorts, not in the mountains. We usually want to be near the ocean, whether it's the Pacific or the Atlantic. We gravitate towards the coast. So you had mentioned your husband had been doing business there, and that's why he was traveling there. And you had this idea that it would be fun to go there for a year. So he already kind of knew where you guys were going to set up shop with the trailer and everything prior to your
Yeah.
arrival. And I'm just curious, like, were you able to connect to electricity? Did you have internet? Did you have a phone? How did that work?
We did have electricity, but it all had to be brought over from the mine manager's house. So he'd been back and forth a number of times, been working on the mine was an old silver mine that they were revamping and making more efficient and increasing the size of. So he was very familiar with the property, where we were going to be staying. And so they had to knock a wall out. The fences are all walled fences. They're all stones and bricks. So they knocked a section out in order for us to get in, and then they built it up behind us. And that's to keep all the wild animals out.
Mhm.
And the water came from the mine. The mine actually supplied the whole town with warm water because it comes out of the ground warm, but it wasn't drinkable. So we hooked up to the trailer with the water, and then we had drinkable water that we could just pick up at the mine site. And the mine site was right outside our door.
When you say pick up water from the mine, do you mean like you had to fill jugs and things and take them back to your trailer?
For drinking water?
Yes.
Drinking water came to the mine because the mine has a commissary. So drinking water would come in by the truckload in big.
Like delivered bottles, like
Yes.
big jugs. Okay, that's what I was trying. I was like, did you go to a well? Was there a well at the mine?
No. And so we had electricity. We had warm water coming in from the mine, drinking water, no internet. If I wanted to use the internet, I had to go down to the mine to use it, and no phone. So we didn't have cell phones or anything there. And one of the fascinating things there was the town had a laundromat. And when you and I think about laundromats, we think about washing machines and dryers, laundromat. This was a covered area that was about 20 by 5 feet with a corrugated steel roof, open to the sides. And along the center, the mine water came in one end, and there were washboards lined up. Well, actually, it was made into the concrete. The lines, like the glass lines of a washboard, were molded into the concrete, and that's where some of the people from town would do their laundry. There was one incident on a Saturday. We used to do our shopping on the Saturday because the mine closed down at noon on Saturday, and that's when the men got paid.
Mhm.
And I say men because it pretty much was mostly men that worked in the mine. It's actually bad luck for a woman to go down into a mine in their culture. So on a Saturday, the money came in to pay them. They get paid in cash, and my husband and I and the dogs were going into Sombrete for groceries, and we're driving along, not thinking much of it. And coming the other way is a Jeep-like truck with a guy in the back on a machine gun on a stand, and he was raring to go. And I'm having palpitations, like what's going on? They weren't
Yeah.
interested in us. They kept right going. We got to town, and when we came back, we were met by the mine people who were so worried that we had been kidnapped because these guys, the guys that came, they were cops, but the mine had been robbed, and the people that were robbing the mine were coming in just as we were going out, and they came in a different way, and so they took the cash, the payroll. It was a pretty exciting day at the
Oh
mine.
my God, but it's true. I guess there is that risk of being kidnapped, and especially when you're 6'2" and white hair and you stand out like a beacon, you know, I think especially in a small town like that, everybody is poor and they see white people from from whether it's United States or Canada or Europe, they think everybody's rich and that they can get some sort of a ransom.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and they thought they might need our vehicle as
Oh,
well.
oh
They
my
thought maybe
goodness.
they would
Well,
put
thank
the
God nothing happened to you.
no, nothing did, but it was an exciting day. I won't forget it.
Oh, I can imagine. And everybody at the mine just must have been up in arms, like terrified about what happened.
They were pretty happy to see us when we got back, I'll tell you.
That must have been terrifying for you. Um,
Interesting. It was terrifying to see the police coming in and not know what was going on, but we were quite happy to get into Los Sombrete because we thought, well, at least we're out of whatever's going on. No cell phone, so you couldn't tell. And and when we got back, happy to see that it all happened and it was finished. And they were still looking for the guys. They never did catch them.
wow, that's crazy. I want to go back to the no phone and no internet. Does that mean that you just wrote up a storm the entire year that you were there?
I actually was not writing fiction when I was there. I should have been writing fiction when I was. I didn't discover that until I got home. But what I did do there was I put together a cookbook because I
Hmm.
knew I needed something to do while I was there. So I brought a huge folder of all the old family recipes, any relative that ever had a recipe. And I've been collecting recipes for years and years and years. And they've all just been in a big mess. And I've never been able to figure out how to access them. So I went through that binder when I was there and sorted them all and typed them all up and clipped out the little pictures and put them on the book. So I have a 4 binder cookbook at home.
Okay, well, I have to ask you, out of those 4 binders, what's your favorite recipe?
Oh, well, probably my husband's mom makes this wild rice and chicken dish. So it's wild rice and white wine and cream and chicken, and it turns. You cook it for a long time, and the cream and the wine turns the rice into rice and gravy, and it is just delicious.
That sounds like a great slow cooker dish, right?
Yes, yes, yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. So I guess the first piece of writing you did was this cookbook. How did you get into the fiction writing and fantasy, mystery? How did that all come about?
Well, we had been in the South for 5 winters in a row by the time I started writing.
Where in
So
the South?
we've been in Tucson for 3 years and Mexico in two, one in the little town, the mining town, and one in the Baja,
Okay.
Mexican Baja. We
Hmm.
spent a winter on a beach there. And then 3 years in Tucson, which was fun. Had a great time. Met some lovely people.
Hmm.
Um, and so the first winter I was home, it was probably September, October timeframe, and the rains had started, and the rains go all winter long. And the wind howls outside the door, and we're right on the water, so the wind just lashes the windows. And so it was dark night, cold. My husband was watching hockey. I was twiddling my thumbs, thinking, "What on earth am I going to do this winter?" And the one thing I did when I was away that was probably the biggest influence is I fell in love with urban fantasy novels. I was reading Carrie Arthur and J.R. Ward and Charlene Harris, that's the other one. And so I was just loving this first person narrative and the immediacy of the stories, especially when they're set in current cities. And
Mhm.
that fascinated me. Although I never thought I'd have an idea big enough for a book. I did think that that winter sitting there, I'm just going to pull my computer in my lap and I'm just going to try to write a scene that is a recurring dream that I have of flying. And I imagined some young woman on the deck, leaping off the deck and flying down the ocean. And I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to try to write that. And I wrote it, and it it really turned out well. I was quite happy with it and surprised and pleased. And so then I thought to myself, oh, wait a second. She can't just jump off the deck. No one would do that without knowing they could fly. So if she can fly, how did she learn she could fly? Who taught her to fly? And then the story kind of built out from that initial scene. And I just kept going and going and going. I was having such a good time. It was like an addiction, that first book. I just couldn't stop writing it. I loved it so much.
And this first book is the one that's behind you, and it's called Secret Sky, correct?
That's right.
And it is part of the Legacy Gift series.
Yes. And there are 7 books in the series.
Whoa,
And
whoa, whoa, 7. I
yes,
didn't even think you could write one book.
I
And
know.
now there's 7 in this series?
Yes, they had babies.
How did that happen?
It's I got the when the first book was finished, I couldn't leave the characters alone. I loved the little world I'd created for them. Well, it's Vancouver, and I love Vancouver, so I just loved the characters, and I thought there was so much more that they had to say, and so many more adventures they could have. So yeah, I just started thinking. I remember when I first started writing, I didn't think I'd ever have a big enough idea, and then enough ideas. And I used to hoard my ideas and hold them back. And by the time I got to the third book, I realized, oh, those ideas are never going to stop. You just use everything you got, put them all in every book. And yes, 7 books later.
Well, it's like a wave. You know what I mean? Like there's always another one. There's always another one that's going to come.
Thank goodness.
So, can you tell us a little more about The Secret Sky?
I'd love to. So, Secret Sky is the story about a secret society of people who can fly. The main protagonist is Emmeline Taylor, and she's a young woman who doesn't even know she can fly. She just knows she's having some trouble with gravity. It keeps leaving her,
Huh.
which is awkward and dangerous. And she decides when she finishes school that she's going to return to the West Coast to her family's small cottage to where she'll have the privacy to learn how to control this thing she has with losing gravity. But she makes a very big mistake and ends up falling from the sky and hurts herself bad enough that she's unconscious and in hospital. And it's there that the doctor that is examining her recognizes a second lens in her eyes that marks her as a flyer. And so he
Hmm.
puts her in touch with a society of people who are like her, and they teach her how to fly and they teach her about their world. But what they don't teach her, and what they're reluctant to tell her, is that they are ruled by a Soviet style tribunal, their kind is, and powerful government forces know about them and they're actively hunting them. And the books keep getting darker and darker.
It's interesting because with a lot of these urban fantasies, there's the supernatural element. It's kind of a consistent theme that there's like a higher power that's trying to like control it or squash it instead of embrace it. And instead of, welcoming this special power, these special people, it's so fascinating how it kind of reflects society, how we all want things to be the status quo, like the tulip thing. You have to cut down the tulips that get too high so they're all even. So I really enjoyed that theme because it's something that's consistent in the world that we live in. And I think it's something that, especially now with everything that's going on in terms of embracing people's differences, whether it's race or culture or gender we are getting to a point in society where we are realizing that embracing our differences is so much more effective than trying to squash them and trying to regulate everybody.
That's a very keen observation.
So I find it fascinating that that's reflected in your book that has this huge supernatural element to it, because the supernatural element just means the difference.
And all the supernatural people are quite happy to have it and play with it and have fun with it. But there's always that bad guy that wants to knock you down.
And you have 7. I still can't get over this. You have 7 books in the series.
One of the books in the series, I actually wrote 4 of them and then thought I'll take a little bit of a breather, a little break. So what I did was I rewrote the first book from a different character's perspective. So one of those 7 books is the story of Secret Sky, but told from Emmeline's lover's perspective. So it's called Lover Betrayed, and it's the first time I wrote from a man's perspective. That was a fascinating experience. And writing that book was really interesting. Like if people read Secret Sky and then they pick up Lover Betrayed, it's the same book, but it's completely different. Starts earlier than Secret Sky, ends later than Secret Sky, and it explains why the lover in Secret Sky, his name's Jackson Delaney, why he behaved the way he did in the first book. Because I had a lot of people ask questions about, like, what was that motivated by? And I knew, of course, but no one else knew. So yeah, it felt good to write that story. And
I've never heard of an author rewriting their book through a different character's point of view. That's one of the most fascinating things I've heard. And now I have to get both of them. I was looking forward to reading Secret Sky anyway, especially since I've started doing these interviews. The pile grows exponentially of all the books that I'm trying to get to. I can't get to them fast enough. But it would be so fascinating to me to read those 2 back to back, to see the difference. And you mentioned that it was the first time you wrote through the voice of a male character. Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience was for you?
It took a lot of research, actually, because you just take for granted that you see the world the way you see it, but you don't. And in particular, my husband was the guinea pig for a lot of that, because I would run a scene past him and he'd say, oh, a man would never say, like, I'm just off the top of my head, I can't think of a precise example, but if I would describe a color and I would call it violet, he would say, no, guys don't do that. Maybe they'll say purple, but more likely they're going to say pink. And they don't speak in really long sentences. The sentences are shorter. I'm not making it out to be Neanderthal man. It's just that men aren't as descriptive as women, and they're much more straightforward in their actions. So, and there's not as much grooming going on. No cooking, or very little cooking. So those kinds of things were fascinating to me to write. And I was constantly putting it in front of men, saying, is this true? Would you do this? Would you say this? Would you behave this way?
Mm-hmm.
And there was one scene in Secret Sky that when I wrote it in Lover Betrayed, I took that into account, because one of the scenes, they train to defend themselves by playing paintball in a giant barn, and they're flying when they're playing paintball. And at the end of the paintball game, Jackson, who's locking the place up afterwards, says, do you want to stay and practice some more? And she looks at the hay loft and says, let's go to the hay loft. And he says, oh no, like, let's fly. And my male friends thought that was ridiculous. A man would never say no to a roll in the hay. Let's go flying instead.
But it's true. The male brain works much differently than the female brain. That's particularly special. The fact that you rewrote from a different point of view. I've really never heard of that before. And now it's like migrated to the top of my list, because the author in me is just so fascinated to compare notes between those 2 books. That just sounds like.
I actually took Secret Sky and copied it into another document, and then I stripped it of everything that wasn't scenes between the 2 or conversations on the phone between the 2. And then I built it out from there.
Okay, so now the important stuff. How does everybody find these wonderful books? How do we find you? How do we find the books?
You can find everything through my website, jpmcleanauthor.com, and you'll find there all of the tidbits about the books. You can download the first chapters of all the books, and there are links
Wonderful.
where you can buy them because they're sold wide. They're sold everywhere. They're Barnes and Noble and Chapters and Kobo, and any bookstore can order them.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today, JP. This was so exciting.
It's been my pleasure, Jen. Lots of fun.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all out there in the interweb for tuning in. Make sure you check out Secret Sky and the Legacy Gift series. And I'd like to challenge all of you out there to do something you never thought you would do. Let us know what it is and where it leads you in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a beautiful day.